Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another video of Counseling 5480 Diagnosis and Treatment Planning class. In today's video, we're going to talk about personality disorders. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you again that we actually have a Q&A Jamboard for this class. You're welcome to leave any kind of comments and questions anonymously on the Jamboard, and I'll make sure to address those questions when we meet again. When reading this chapter, you probably identified one or two traits from each one of the personality disorders. Do you have personality disorder? The chances is very low at this point. But what you're feeling is perfectly normal because traits of personality disorders are present in average or so-called normal people. They're just more accentuated in those with personality disorders. Personality disorders are enduring and pervasive. What that means is that the symptoms are often stable over a long duration, such as years or decades, and they're also across different settings. So, like the people behaving the same way at home, at work, at school, to different people. I mean, they're pretty consistent, uh, regardless of how they're or who they're interacting with. As far as the cause for personality disorder, it's pretty similar to most of other mental disorders. Is that we're not sure, but they are related to genetics and some other factors, especially like trauma and abuse. Research showed that the childhood sexual abuse is closely related to some of the personality disorders, especially borderline personality disorder. And verbal abuse, such as yelling, belittling, cursing, um, that kind of abuse also cause personality traits of borderline personality, narcissistic personality, um, oppressive, compulsive personality disorder in childhood. And remember, people with the traits of personality disorders don't necessarily get the diagnosis. They will only receive the diagnosis if they have an issue with it, if they really struggle with it, if those things are, if their personality traits are significantly impacting on their daily life. And something else to keep in mind is that people with personality disorders often also have other comorbid mental disorders that we really need to identify and differentiate. Before describing individual personality disorders, DSM-5 provided specific criteria for general personality disorder. Now, this is not a diagnosis. Instead, it's more of like a prerequisite for people in order for them to be considered as any one of a personality disorder. And when you're doing your diagnostic sheet for this class, if you ever want to consider someone with a specific personality diagnosis, you would need to make a list of the general criteria of general personality disorder, compare and contrast, and then if they meet all the criteria for GPD, and then you go into much more detailed criteria for a specific personality disorder. I hope that makes sense. But we will have a case study so you will see how you do it. And then once again, we should always take the individual's personal cultural background into consideration. Yes, people with personality disorder, they have a pattern of their an enduring pattern of their behaviors, and it is pervasive. And those patterns, pervasive enduring patterns, are deviating markedly from the expectations of their culture, not the mainstream culture, not your culture, but from their culture. So that's just something to keep in mind. Based on their shared characteristics, personality disorders in the DSM-5 have been grouped into cluster A, B, and C. In cluster A, there are three PD types: paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. People of these three types of PD are usually described as being very guarded and odd and socially eccentric. Cluster B includes four PD types: antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. Clients who struggle with these diagnoses are being described as very dramatic, easily emotional, and unpredictable. And finally, in cluster C, there are three different PD types: avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders. People with these diagnoses are usually anxious and fearful. Alright, let's start from cluster A. First, let's look at paranoid personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of distrust and suspiciousness such that others' motives are interpreted as malevolent. People with paranoid personality disorder has extreme trouble trusting others, which cause them not having too many friends or confidants. An example would be a person got sick, so an ambulance took the person to the hospital, but in the hospital, this person refuses to take any medication simply because they don't trust nurses and doctors, and there may be very even suspicious that the nurses and doctors will do harm to them rather than save them. And when it comes to this diagnosis, we really need to think about the culture context, because people from marginalized groups, such as minority people like Latinx, transgender, undocumented people, they may also have trouble trusting others around them, and they may not have many friends or confidants, but for different reasons. So we need to be able to differentiate that. The next disorder is schizoid PD, refers to a pattern of detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression. People with schizoid personality disorder usually avoid human interaction. They don't enjoy human connections. They don't have friends or partner. Um, very likely. Um, it's different. They're different from people with paranoid personality disorder, because they may both of these groups of people, they may be isolated. They don't have many friends, but paranoid PD, they don't have friends because they can't trust people. But schizoid PD, um, they don't have friends because they just don't really enjoy human interaction. If you have watched Lars and Real Girl, you would know that the main character Lars, from that movie, were extremely shy, and they find it impossible to make friends or socialize with others. So eventually, um, he met a girl on the internet, and he decided that that girl is his girlfriend. But that girl is actually a life-size plastic woman rather than a real woman, and he was totally fine with it. The last PD here we're going to talk about is schizotypal personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of acute discomfort in close relationships, cognitive or perceptual distortions, and magical thinking. People with schizotypal personality disorders are often described as odd or strange based on the way they dress, the way they act or think. Um, the symptoms of schizotypal personality disorder are similar to those under schizophrenia, but they are not severe enough to meet schizophrenia criteria. Some of the people who receive this diagnosis unfortunately do develop schizophrenia later. So this diagnosis actually serves as a precursor for schizophrenia. An example would be Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter, who is my favorite character. But still, her actions um, can be resembled to someone who struggle with schizotypal personality disorder. So after learning about cluster A personality disorders, I want you to think about these two questions, and we're going to discuss about these in our next week's class. What is an important factor to consider when working with clients with a cluster A diagnosis? And how might clients present themselves within a therapeutic relationship? If you still remember, personality disorders in cluster B are characterized as being dramatic, emotional, and erratic. So let's start with the famous antisocial personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. So people in this categories are usually criminals, um, like serial killers. They enjoy violates others, the rights of others, and they don't have much remorse. They they break rules very easily. They don't respect the law. Oftentimes they just lie, without any trouble. Examples of because I'm a Harry Potter fan, so I'm using that reference a lot. So Voldemort would be an example, and if you are also a fan of Joker, Joker actually has some antisocial traits as well. Next one is another famous personality disorder, which is borderline. It's referred to a pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, affects, and marked impulsivity. Basically, everything is very unstable for people with borderline personality disorder. They view others as either all good or all bad. It is very common that the borderline PD client would tell you that, oh, you're the best counselor in the world. You should win Nobel Prize. You're the only person who understands them. You're everything, you're the best. You feel like you're the king or the queen of the world. And then the next time they may come in and then they say, "Oh, how dare you're doing this? I was wrong. I was totally wrong. You're the worst one of all time. I've never met anyone who's worse than you." So it's very unstable. And that is their inner world. It's not something that they enjoy doing. And, people just think about this. They're always experiencing highs and lows at the extreme. So they tend to have a lot more self-harming behaviors. And because sometimes, even though they don't intend to kill themselves, they sometimes still harm themselves by accident. So, suicidal ideation, suicide assessment is definitely important for people with borderline personality disorders. Next one, histrionic personality disorder, refers to a pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking. People with histrionic personality disorders are usually flamboyant. They like attention. They are seduced. They can be seductive. They're really uncomfortable if they're not the center of the attention. And very unfortunately, people have tried to use this disorder or this diagnosis as an excuse of sexual abuse, such as if you know Jerry Sandusky, he had done 52 counts of sexual abuse of young boys. If you're interested in learning more about how he was trying to use this diagnosis and how psychiatrists and psychologists or mental health professionals are evaluating him, feel free to click on this link. The last one in cluster B is Another famous narcissistic personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. And I think you're probably very familiar with this jargon already, even before you read this chapter. So people with narcissistic personality disorders, they sincerely believe they have a very heightened importance. Um, they're the king of the world. They're the queen of the world. An example would be the like Charles Mason. He is a cult leader, and in fact, maybe many cult leaders they have some narcissistic traits. Similarly, I also want you to think about what is an important factor to consider when working with clients with a cluster B diagnosis and how might they present themselves in a counseling session. And we will discuss these questions in class. Personality disorders in cluster C are characterized as being anxious and fearful. The first one, avoidant PD, refers to a pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative emotions. People with this diagnosis are extremely timid and shy. They do not wish to, they do wish to have friends, but they're just too afraid of being rejected or too afraid of being criticized. And people with this diagnosis have extremely low self-esteem. A close example would be probably Boo Radley from To Kill a Mockingbird. Next one is dependent personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of submissive and clingy behavior related to an excessive need to be taken care of. People with dependent personality disorders are usually very passive and they allow others to direct their lives. They think themselves as being stupid or helpless. An example would be Buster Blood from Arrested Development. When it comes to dependent personality disorder, I always try to also evaluate the possibility of adult abuse. um, I think there's a difference. Like for example, I had a client who is very independent and a family friend. She reported that she had disability, but I never figured out what disability she had because she was not able to clearly describe. So I thought she was probably dependent, like have this diagnosis, but with further um, asking her questions, I found out that she wasn't like this. She only become like this in the past several years, and then the more information I got from her, the more um, confident I am with that. She's probably under adult abuse rather than being just having a dependent personality. So yeah, that's something to think about. And then the last one is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which refers to a pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control. People with OCPD are like to describe themselves as perfectionists. They don't like the change of routine. They have plans for almost everything. Does that sound familiar? A close example could be graduate students that sound like you. But again, please don't self-diagnosing. You probably share certain traits because graduate school made you this way, right? We want you to be structured and organized, but those are the skills you learned. And remember, personality disorder traits need to be, across all different settings. If you're only like this when it comes to study, then you're okay. If you only like this with school, you're okay. Another example is probably Monica from Friends. Again, please thinking about what would be an important factor to consider when working with clients with a cluster C diagnosis and how might they present themselves in the counseling session. Three other personality disorder diagnoses are personality change due to another medical condition and other specified personality disorder as well as unspecified personality disorder. Now, let's check out the case study. As what we mentioned earlier, before we narrow down to a specific personality disorder, we need to compare the case with the criteria in DSM-5 for general personality disorder listed on page 647. Okay, so first step is to compare the criteria for general personality disorder with our case study. So the first criterion requires an enduring pattern that with manifestations in two of the four areas. So the first one is cognition. We did not see much evidence from the case. And then the other three areas we did see evidence. So let's go one by one. Affectivity is evidenced by the client's words when he described the girl that he had sex with as she didn't object when she was getting laid. And then it's also evidenced by his response or his description of his mom that she can always get another job. So these things demonstrate that he had inappropriate emotional responses. And then the next area is interpersonal functioning, as evidenced by him not being able to maintain meaningful relationships with parents and partners. And as well as the last area, impulse control, as evidenced by him assaulting two corporals. Criterion B refers to that the enduring pattern to be inflexible and pervasive across a broad range. So this criterion is evidenced by the client does not demonstrate ability to see others' perspectives on the situations, on different situations, nor did he reflect in his continued lifelong criminal-like behaviors. Then we're seeing this very familiar criterion C, which is clinically significant distress or impairment. So in this case, even though the client didn't seem to be bothered too much by the symptoms, there are impairment has been done to his daily functioning, as evidenced by there's actually no relationships of him with family, and he was not able to keep a job. And then the next criterion refers to the enduring pattern is stable and of long duration. And so this criterion is evidenced by the fact that this pattern can trace back to adolescence based on the father's report. Criterion E is our differential diagnosis criterion. So the evidence for this one is that the client denies consistent use of substances and evidence does not indicate abuse. So that help us to rule out substance use diagnosis. In addition, his behaviors are not categorized into any impulse control disorders very well. Because of lifetime of evidence of this antisocial behavior, we can also rule out the Z code of adult antisocial behaviors. And then the final criterion, F, is the one that requires the symptoms are not caused by substance use or any other medical conditions. So the evidence for this criterion is that, yes, even though he did report substance use, it was not very consistent. And there's not any evidence showing that, this pattern is caused by substance use at this point. and there's also no medical conditions reported. As a matter of fact, since the client's presenting issues are so long withstanding, they're all like long-term issues. Most likely, they're not due to simply substance use or general medical conditions. Then we're seeing this very familiar criterion C, which is clinically significant distress or impairment. So in this case, even though the client didn't seem to be bothered too much by the symptoms, there are impairment has been done to his daily functioning, as evidenced by there's actually no relationships of him with family, and he was not able to keep a job. And then the next criterion refers to the enduring pattern is stable and of long duration. And so this criterion is evidenced by the fact that this pattern can trace back to adolescence based on the father's report. Criterion E is our differential diagnosis criterion. So the evidence for this one is that the client denies consistent use of substances and evidence does not indicate abuse. So that help us to rule out substance use diagnosis. In addition, his behaviors are not categorized into any impulse control disorders very well. Because of lifetime of evidence of this antisocial behavior, we can also rule out the Z code of adult antisocial behaviors. And then the final criterion, F, is the one that requires the symptoms are not caused by substance use or any other medical conditions. So the evidence for this criterion is that, yes, even though he did report substance use, it was not very consistent, and there's not any evidence showing that this pattern is caused by substance use at this point. And there's also no medical conditions reported. As a matter of fact, since the client's presenting issues are so long withstanding, they're all like long-term issues. Most likely, they're not due to simply substance use or general medical conditions. Then we're seeing this very familiar criterion C, which is clinically significant distress or impairment. So in this case, even though the client didn't seem to be bothered too much by the symptoms, there are impairment has been done to his daily functioning, as evidenced by there's actually no relationships of him with family, and he was not able to keep a job. And then the next criterion refers to the enduring pattern is stable and of long duration. And so this criterion is evidenced by the fact that this pattern can trace back to adolescence based on the father's report. Criterion E is our differential diagnosis criterion. So the evidence for this one is that the client denies consistent use of substances and evidence does not indicate abuse. So that help us to rule out substance use diagnosis. In addition, his behaviors are not categorized into any impulse control disorders very well. Because of lifetime of evidence of this antisocial behavior, we can also rule out the Z code of adult antisocial behaviors. And then the final criterion, F, is the one that requires the symptoms are not caused by substance use or any other medical conditions. So the evidence for this criterion is that, yes, even though he did report substance use, it was not very consistent, and there's not any evidence showing that this pattern is caused by substance use at this point. And there's also no medical conditions reported. As a matter of fact, since the client's presenting issues are so long withstanding, they're all like long-term issues. Most likely, they're not due to simply substance use or general medical conditions. When it comes to assessment tools of personality disorder, there are a few we can choose. The first one is the Millen Clinical Multi-Axel Inventory 4. This one is a comprehensive tool that evaluates an individual's personality functioning. This tool, which is simply called MCMI, contains 195 items, which consist of 25 subscales. These subscales parallel the personality disorders in DSM-5, and they were developed based on specific personality theories in the mental health field. Usually it takes about 25 to 35 minutes for people to complete. The next one is the famous MMPI, and the newest version is the MMPI 2RF. And some of you may be familiar with this already. For those of you who haven't heard about this, I'm pretty sure your adult appraisal class will cover MMPI. But basically, this is another comprehensive tool which focuses on measuring personality traits of people. It takes about 35 to 50 minutes for adults to complete. So the first two assessments are more of like an inventory kind of thing. But the last one, the one at the bottom, the structured clinical interview for DSM-5 personality disorders, this one is not an inventory or questionnaire. Instead, this is a semi-structured diagnostic interview protocol for mental health clinicians to also evaluate the personality disorders listed in DSM-5. So basically, this is a um, a tool that help you to ask the right questions in order to decide whether or not this person has certain personality disorders. And something you need to note is that special trainings are needed to use any of these three assessments. So the research on the treatment for personality disorders tend to be case study based or theoretical or conceptual pieces of literature. So what that means is that there is still a lack of empirical evidence for the treatment of personality disorder. Some of the most commonly used approaches are CBT, DBT, schema therapy, and emotion focused therapy. You can choose the one that fits to your theory the best. But overall, the treatment interventions focus on relieving the immediate symptoms, of course. It usually needs a very long time for clinicians and the clients to address the underlying issues, which are probably the root of personality disorder. When working with people with PD, there's always a tendency to incorporate some level of psychodynamic approach just because the relationship to early life experience like their childhood and family of origin is kind of important for people who have personality disorder later on. So I'd like for you to think about a few things when working with someone who has a personality disorder. The first thing is that just to know the treatment will be most likely long term. According to Paris 1999, it needs on average of 192 sessions for the reduction of 50% of the symptoms, and that number has increased to 216 sessions for the reduction of 75% of the symptoms. So when someone who with a PD diagnosis asks you, how much time am I looking at right now? How many sessions am I looking at right now? Um, you can just let them know, we're looking at years of work. and that is normal and it's okay. They may be on and off. That is the nature of this kind of treatment. An indicator of some good prognosis is the insight. So the more insight they have, the more, when I say insight, I really mean, they realize that things are not working, and they're able to click, they're able to follow the treatment. And that's usually a really good indicator for better prognosis. Adjunct services are also very important. So while you are working with them regarding the symptoms, you also want to kind of help them locate some of resources that they can benefit from. Many of the PD clients, they struggle with not being able to hold a job, or some troubles in work. Career counseling could be something that they can consider. They can learn some effective skills in work. If they are happen to use substance, then substance support groups are helpful, or any kind of support groups are usually very helpful. Family and couples counseling are essentially helpful for those who have a family and partner. Because of their personality traits, there may be some arguments, some relationship issues that can be overwhelming. So yeah, family and couples therapy can be a really good choice for them. And medication is another choice. But again, it's just like a bandage. We want them to take medication so that they can manage the symptoms in order to incorporate some new coping skills, or to work better in the counseling sessions. The goal is, eventually they can get off the meds, but um, if it can help them to just stabilize them, it is better that we use that. Okay, so that's all the content I prepared for this chapter. I hope you find this lecture to be helpful, and as always, feel free to email me with any of your questions. Post your questions on Jamboard, and I hope you take care, and I'll see you in the next lecture and next week. Bye.